In 1587, a group of 117 English men, women, and children landed on Roanoke Island, a narrow strip of land just off the present-day coast of North Carolina. Backed by courtier Sir Walter Raleigh, the venture aimed to plant England's first lasting settlement in the New World. The settlers chose John White, an artist who had mapped the region, as their governor, and his daughter Eleanor soon gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in North America. Only weeks after arriving, Governor White sailed home to gather much-needed supplies. England's war with Spain delayed him for 3 anxious years. When he finally returned in August of 1590, he found the settlement eerily abandoned. The houses were gone, the timbers apparently removed, chests and tools had vanished, and the palisade stood empty. The single clue was the word Croatoan, carved into a fort post, along with the letters C-R-O, cut into a nearby tree. There were no signs of battle, no graves, and no settlers. The disappearance quickly became known as the Lost Colony. Over the next 4 centuries, historians, archaeologists, and scientists have searched for answers, suggesting everything from peaceful assimilation with native neighbors to violent disaster. Modern techniques, including genetic testing of local families, have added new pieces to the puzzle. Yet the fate of the colonists remains one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries. In this video, we will examine each major explanation, weigh the evidence, and rank the theories from most to least likely. First, we'll start off with some historical background. Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, wanted to plant an English stronghold in North America that could raid Spanish shipping and mine new sources of wealth. To find a suitable site, he financed a scouting voyage in 1584 led by captains Philip Amadis and Arthur Barlow. The explorers sailed to an island the Carolina Algonquin people called Roanoke. Located between the Atlantic Ocean and the shallow Pamlico Sound, they returned to England with 2 native emissaries named Manteo and Wanchese, and spoke glowingly of the island's climate and resources, convincing Raleigh that the location could support a permanent colony. Raleigh next organized a military settlement that left Plymouth in 1585 under the leadership of Sir Richard Grenville and Ralph Lane. Lane's men erected a wooden fort on Roanoke Island, mapped the sounds and rivers, and attempted to live off local game, fish, and crops. Relations with nearby Algonquin towns soured when Lane demanded food during a lean spring, and his soldiers killed the regional leader, Wingina. The small garrison survived the winter but grew restless when the privateer Sir Francis Drake stopped by in June of 1586 after raiding Spanish ports in the Caribbean. Most of the colonists chose to abandon the fort and sail home with him. Grenville arrived weeks later, found the fort deserted, and left 15 men to hold the claim until a new colony could arrive. Undeterred, Raleigh approved a 3rd expedition that included families and craftsmen and appointed the artist John White as governor. The group of roughly 120 settlers, which included White's daughter Eleanor and her newborn Virginia Dare, left England in 1587. Their pilot was supposed to carry them north to Chesapeake Bay, but for reasons never recorded, he set them ashore once more at Roanoke. White tried to rebuild relations with neighboring villages while his people repaired the palisade and planted gardens. Only weeks later, the colonists persuaded him to sail back to England for fresh supplies and more settlers. White reached England just as the Anglo-Spanish War peaked, and the Spanish Armada threatened invasion. Every seaworthy English ship was held back for defense, and White could not obtain passage across the Atlantic until 1590. When he finally returned to Roanoke, he found the houses dismantled and the settlers gone. The only trace was the word Croatoan, carved into a post, and the letter C-R-O cut into a nearby tree. Croatoan was the contemporary name for Hatteras Island, a long barrier island south of Roanoke. The fate of the settlers has been debated ever since, and is now known as the mystery of the Lost Colony. So before we get to the theories, I just want to explain our ranking criteria. To compare each explanation for the Lost Colony fairly, we first need clear rules for judging evidence. Historians place the greatest truth in physical remains because objects can be dated, measured, and inspected repeatedly. When archaeologists uncover English tools or building debris in the Carolina sand, they are looking at items the settlers themselves handled. Such artifacts provide direct proof of activity on a site and often include clues about how long people stayed there and what they were doing. Written records come next in reliability. Letters, maps, and reports created at the time preserve first-hand observations, though they must be weighed against authors' motives and the limits of what they personally saw. Oral traditions hold a different kind of value. Stories preserved by native families can retain details lost to official papers, especially when those stories are tied to specific places or family lines. Because memory changes over generations, researchers seek versions told by several independent speakers before using the information as historical evidence. Environmental data, such as tree ring studies, adds context by revealing droughts, floods, or storms that might force a settlement to move. Finally, modern DNA and genealogy projects look for living descendants of the colonists. Genetic matches are powerful because they trace a biological connection, but the results can be clouded by centuries of intermarriage and population movement, so they are treated as supporting evidence rather than absolute proof. When these 5 lines of evidence point in the same direction, a theory rises to the top of our ranking. If they conflict, or if one line is missing, the explanation moves lower. The upcoming analysis applies this hierarchy to every major proposal about the fate of the Roanoke settlers, so that the final order reflects the strongest overall case rather than the most dramatic story. Theory number 1, assimilation with the Croatoan tribe. The most widely accepted explanation proposes that the colonists left Roanoke Island voluntarily and moved 40 nautical miles south to Hatteras Island, which the Carolina Algonquin people called Croatoan. The theory rests first on geography. Hatteras is reachable by small boats that the settlers possessed, and it offered abundant fish, fertile sandy ridges for corn, and friendly allies in the Croatoan village, headed by the interpreter Manteo. Because the word Croatoan was carved into the fort's palisade, many historians believe the colonists meant to signal exactly where they had gone. Archaeology has supplied strong material support for this idea. Recent excavations at Buxton on Hatteras Island uncovered thousands of iron fragments known as hammer scale, the debris of a smith's forge, alongside Tudor period gun flints, a rapier guard, and shards of English pottery. All of these items were found inside soil layers that also contained native cooking pits and shell middens, showing that English and Croatoan households shared the same living space, rather than occupying separate camps. One excavation area revealed post holes, hearthstones, and slag consistent with a forge, evidence that trained English smiths worked there for an extended stay. Oral history from Hatteras families adds a human dimension. Local stories describe ancestors with gray eyes, sandy hair, and English-style farming methods who merged into Croatoan society during the late 16th century. These narratives persist across different family lines, suggesting a common memory rather than a single embellished tale. Modern genetic work provides encouraging, although still inconclusive clues. The Lost Colony Y-DNA project has tested men carrying surnames linked to the settlers and men whose families have lived on Hatteras for centuries. One small paternal group, labeled the Parry cluster, appears both in England and in several Hatteras lineages, hinting at a biological bridge between the two communities. Researchers caution that the dataset is still small and that centuries of intermarriage can blur signals, but the results point in the same direction as the artifacts and oral accounts. Taken together, the carved message, the concentration of English goods within Croatoan layers, and the tentative genetic matches make assimilation with the Croatoan tribe the leading candidate for solving the mystery. The main weakness is the absence of confirmed human remains that could be directly linked to the colonists, leaving final proof still out of our reach. Theory number 2, inland relocation to Site X and Site Y. Some researchers believe these settlers left Roanoke Island in small boats, traveled about 50 miles west along the sheltered sounds, and built a new outpost on the mainland shore of present-day Bertie County, North Carolina. This idea gained momentum in 2012 when staff at the British Museum examined an Elizabethan map drawn by Governor John White called La Virginia Pars. Under a small patch meant to correct the parchment, they discovered a hidden red symbol shaped like a palisaded fort at the point where the Roanoke and the Chowan rivers meet. The location matches White's notes that the colonists planned to move 50 miles into the Main, which in 16th century English meant inland. Archaeologists from the non-profit First Colony Foundation, led by Nicholas Lucchetti, surveyed the exact spot and named it Site X. Excavations at the edge of Salmon Creek have revealed green glazed border-ware pottery, a rapier guard, a copper aglet used to lace clothing, and fragments of a snaphuance lock, an early form of flintlock mechanism. All of these items were made in England during the late 1500s, the same period as the Lost Colony. The artifacts lay in soil mixed with Algonquin cooking pits and stone flakes, suggesting that a modest group of English newcomers lived among native neighbors rather than founding a large walled town. Across the creek lies a second location called Site Y. Test pits there have produced similar Surrey, Hampshire pottery shards in very small numbers, hinting that the settlers may have broken into even smaller parties and spread out along the riverbank to farm or trade. Because only a few English objects have been found on each site, most scholars think no more than a dozen colonists could have moved inland, while the rest went elsewhere. Genetic researchers have begun collecting DNA samples from families whose ancestors lived for centuries in Bertie County to look for links to England, but so far no published matches tie them directly to names on the 1587 passenger list. More excavations and a larger genetic database are needed before the inland relocation theory can be confirmed or rejected. The inland theory benefits from the clear fort symbol on John White's map and the presence of unmistakably English household goods far from Roanoke Island. Its weakness is the small number of artifacts, which at present cannot account for every missing man, woman, and child. Until larger settlement remains or human DNA evidence turns up, the idea remains a strong but incomplete explanation. Theory number 3, integration with the coastal Algonquins and the Lumbee people. A third explanation suggests that many of the Roanoke settlers journeyed west along the shallow rivers and settled among the coastal Algonquin towns that once lined the Lumber River of southeastern North Carolina. Over the next 2 centuries, those towns absorbed newcomers from other tribes and from Europe, and their mixed descendants later became known as the Lumbee people. Supporters of this idea point to travel routes that connect Roanoke Island to the Lumber River by a continuous chain of protected sounds and streams, which small English boats could navigate without entering the open Atlantic. Early observers noticed that families in the region carried the English surname Parry, which appears on the 1587 passenger list along with Dial, Oxendine, and Locklear, names that surface in the region by the 18th century and may reflect later English origin. 19th century legislators in North Carolina cited light hair, gray eyes, and the continued use of archaic English words when they argued that the Lumbee must be part English in origin. Lumbee oral tradition repeats stories of fair-skinned ancestors who arrived from the coast, bringing iron tools and new farming methods, and then married into native households. Genetic projects have tried to test these theories. Since 2007, the Lost Colony Y-DNA project and companion Lumbee studies have collected Y chromosome samples from men who trace their male line to Robeson County. A small group of testers who bear the Parry surname share a paternal signature that also appears in England, raising the possibility of a link to Parry colonists. The overall Lumbee data shows many centuries of marriage with Europeans and Africans, which makes it hard to pick out the signal of a single 16th century village. Yet researchers continue to build a larger sample in hopes of clearer matches. The Lumbee integration theory benefits from travel geography, matching surnames, persistent family stories, and a few promising DNA hints. Its main weakness is the lack of firmly dated English artifacts in Robeson County soils, and the absence, so far, of a definitive genetic match to a documented colonist line. Until either kind of evidence turns up, the theory remains a strong possibility rather than a proven solution. Theory number 4, relocation to Chesapeake Bay and the Powhatan massacre. Another possibility is that the Roanoke colonists moved north to the Chesapeake Bay and settled among a tribe called the Chesapeans, only to be destroyed by the Powhatan Confederacy a few years later. The Chesapeake was the original destination of the 1587 expedition before the pilot left the settlers at Roanoke, so the survivors may have tried to reach their intended home once they realized help was not coming quickly. The Chesapeake route lay along a chain of sheltered inlets that small boats could follow without venturing far into the Atlantic, making the journey feasible for families. Support for this theory comes from Jamestown writers who recorded native testimony. William Strachey, the secretary of the Jamestown colony, wrote in 1612 that Chief Powhatan told English leaders he had wiped out a group of people living with the Chesapeans because a prophecy warned that strangers would overthrow his rule. John Smith heard a similar account and noted that Powhatan showed him brass kettles and iron tools to prove the deed. If true, these items could have come from the missing settlers. A massacre would also explain why no later travelers reported seeing English families among the Chesapeake tribes. The chief weakness of the Powhatan story is the lack of archaeological or genetic evidence. No settlements remain with 16th century English artifacts have been found around the lower Chesapeake, and no graves containing European bones from that period have been identified. Some historians suspect the story was exaggerated by Powhatan to intimidate Jamestown, while others think the Jamestown chroniclers may have misinterpreted Powhatan's words. Until excavations uncover physical traces of English dwellings or DNA links in the region, the Chesapeake relocation remains possible but unproven. Theory 5, catastrophic drought-driven dispersal. Some scholars argue that an extreme drought struck the Carolina coast just as the Roanoke settlers were trying to establish themselves, driving them to abandon the island in search of food and water. Scientists reconstructed 16th century rainfall by measuring the growth rings of centuries-old bald cypress trees that still grow along nearby rivers. Narrow rings mark years when rain was scarce because trees add less wood during dry summers. The ring pattern reveals that the years 1587 to 1589 were the driest 3-year stretch in 800 years for the tidewater region of Virginia and North Carolina. In the thin coastal soil of Roanoke Island, a drought of that magnitude would have withered corn, dried shallow wells, and pushed wildlife inland, leaving the colony without reliable food or water. A crisis of this scale could explain why the settlers removed usable timbers rather than simply leaving the houses to rot. Lumber and iron spikes were valuable resources if the colonists decided to move to better ground. The drought may also have strained relations with neighboring Algonquin towns, which would have struggled to feed their own people. Faced with hunger, the English families may have split into smaller groups and sought assistance wherever they could find it, whether among friendly tribes on Hatteras Island, along the mainland rivers, or up in the Chesapeake. The drought theory therefore supports several relocation scenarios rather than standing alone. The weakness of the explanation is that it accounts for the motive to leave, but not the settlers' ultimate fate. No human remains have been tied to starvation on Roanoke. The archaeologists have not found abandoned farm plots or food caches dating to the drought years. Until material or genetic evidence links the drought directly to a known destination, the environmental disaster remains an important context note rather than a full solution. Theory number 6, secret Spanish raid from Florida. This one's my personal favorite. During the late 16th century, Spain and England were locked in open conflict, and Spanish officials worried that an English base on the Carolina coast would shelter pirates hunting their treasure fleets. In 1588, King Philip II sent Captain Vicente Gonzalez north from St. Augustine to search for the rumored outpost. Gonzalez reached Port Ferdinando at the Outer Banks first, found the place deserted, and noted a few buried barrels, then sailed north to explore the Chesapeake Bay before returning to Florida. Despite his negative report, Spanish courtiers continued to debate a preemptive strike, citing their swift destruction of the French settlement at Fort Caroline in 1565 as proof that surprise attacks could eliminate rival colonies before they took root. No documents survived that order an assault on Roanoke, but English captains feared one enough that they armed their relief fleets for battle. Historians who favored the Spanish raid argue that Gonzalez's reconnaissance in 1588 showed Spain knew exactly where to land troops, and that the disappearance of every man, woman, and child is easier to explain as a sudden military sweep than as a peaceful migration. Critics counter that Spanish archives are remarkably detailed about frontier expeditions, yet none mention a Carolina attack, and archaeologists have never found Spanish muskets, armor plates, or ammunition on Roanoke Island. Without physical evidence of combat, the secret raid remains an intriguing possibility rather than any sort of proven fact. And of course, Theory 7, fringe and supernatural explanations. The most imaginative ideas about the lost colony step outside ordinary history and propose causes that range from paranormal to extraterrestrial. Some writers suggest that a violent storm swept the settlers out to sea in a manner later popularized by tales of the Bermuda Triangle, even though the Outer Banks lie well north of that region. Others claim that witchcraft or curses struck the community, pointing to the word Croatoan as a supposed spell that appears in later American folklore. A few modern storytellers describe alien abduction, time slips, or interdimensional portals to explain why no trace of the colonists has ever been found. While these scenarios make for gripping fiction, they offer no physical artifacts, no documentary references from the 16th century, and no scientific data to support them. Historians therefore view fringe theories as cultural reflections of each era's fears and fascinations, rather than as serious solutions to the mystery of Roanoke. The combined trail of carved messages, Tudor-era metalwork, and a small but growing set of DNA hints points most clearly to the settlers moving south to Croatoan on Hatteras Island and living alongside their Algonquin hosts. Excavations at Buxton have uncovered buckets of hammer scale, English weapon fragments, and forge-related features within native household layers. Local families still recount stories of fair-skinned ancestors, and a tentative Y chromosome link known as the Parry cluster appears in both Carolina and English lines. Taken together, these strands place assimilation at the top of the evidence ladder. Other explanations stand lower but remain plausible. The discovery of a hidden fort symbol on Governor John White's map and English pottery at Site X and Y suggests that a smaller party pushed inland toward the Albemarle Sound, while tree ring studies confirm a record drought that could have forced hungry families to scatter. Farther north, Jamestown chroniclers report that Powhatan boasted of killing strangers living with the Chesapeakeans, a story that keeps the Chesapeake massacre in contention, though no artifacts have been found to prove it. Even with decades of digging and laboratory work, the mystery endures. Each summer's excavation sieves more soil, each DNA kit widens the genetic map, and each archival review may yet reveal a forgotten line of text. Until a set of human remains or a trove of household goods ties one destination to every missing name, the lost colony will continue to invite research and imagination. Viewers with Carolina roots, family legends, or historical skills can still play a part in closing one of America's oldest cold cases.